All right. And so I believe we are live now. I'll give it a second just to get going. And I think that's it. Hello, everybody. Thank you once again for joining us for poetry, the series Poetry from the Field. My name is Marcelo Hernandez Castillo, and I am the Poet Laureate for Yuba-Sutter counties. And I am truly honored today to be joined by poet Joshua McKinney and former professor of mine at Sacramento State University. And so today we're gonna have the pleasure to hear Dr. Josh McKinney read some new poems and then read a poem from his latest collection, Small Cillian. And we will welcome some questions from the audience towards the end. I will field some questions if you have any, and just write them into the comments. If you're watching on Facebook Live, write them into the comments of the post. If you're on YouTube, write them into the YouTube comments and they would pop up here. So again, thanks so much to the Yuba-Sutter Regional Arts Council, to Abby Cecina and David Reed and everybody else at the Regional Arts Council for allowing and for facilitating all of this programming. And check out their schedule. They have a bunch of other programming around the literary arts, as well as other programming around theater, and so on and so forth. So check them out, see what's going on. And so let's get started. Just a little bit about Josh McKinney. As I said, his most recent book of poems is Small Cillian, and he has work appeared in journals such as Boulevard, Denver Quarterly, Kenyon Review, New American Writing, and many others. He's a recipient of the Dorothy Brunsman Poetry Prize, the Dickinson Prize, the Pavement Saw Chapbook Prize, and the Gertrude Stein Award for Innovative Writing. He runs a ecopoetics magazine, Clade Song, with co-editor Tim Call, and is professor of poetry of creative writing at Sacramento State University. Josh, it is a pleasure. Welcome.
Thank you, Marcelo. Good to see you and good to be here. I'll start with a poem from Small Cillian. This poem is entitled Lepus. Got a little light there from my book, which is Latin for rabbit. I thought I saw through the ear of a hare, where it sat in the morning sun, light glow behind dilated vessels there, so near the warmth of the ambient air, yet below the heart's heat at the hare's core. And what's more, I thought I could hear the blood rush down into its long limbs, abeyant, aware as the nerve current sang in its flesh. And I smelled sage merge with stone, fresh earth breath after pre-dawn rain, the wet nearly gone as the sun rose, and the hare, unmoving forth in its massive stillness, leapt fierce and alone with its ear light through me. My bifocals are no longer functional, so I'm back to an old pair of glasses here. Bear with me. I'll read some new poems now, and this poem, I ride my bicycle when the weather's good, up near Beals Point. I live in Fair Oaks, and I go up to Folsom Lake and ride around there. And there's a place right over the highway where a hawk perches on a lamppost. It's always, I see it almost every time I ride up there. And that was part of the catalyst for this poem, which is titled Allure. A hawk hath been hid conspicuously and most high upon a lamppost, red-shouldered as with blood bedight. In the day's exhausted light, its swivel-headed, arrow-keen and earthward gaze surveys the evening gold grown over the rush-hour crush of cars, where, locked in traffic, I break, creep forward, break, until, some nameless progress fulfilled, I pass at last, useless and low, beneath that huge disdain, and feel some puling part of me flushed forth from the sheltering roadside ditch grass, skeltering and blind, to be seized in the talons of that terrible sight. Inviolable good has drawn my busted eyes into the mirror of my passing, where plume sheen dazzles in last light, and my ravening, two-bellied heart leaps upon the air. This next poem, recently I've been reading a lot of surrealist work, trying to incorporate some of those things into my own. And I don't know about people these days, but when I was a lad in the green fields of Iowa, where I lived until I was 7, there were all sorts of strange methods for pulling a child's teeth. I don't know why they would do these things. Maybe it was supposed to toughen you up. And I'm not sure maybe they even intended on doing it, but they would say things like, if you don't quit wiggling that loose tooth, I'm going to tie it to a string and tie it to a doorknob and slam the door. Or my grandmother used to say, I'm going to tie a string to your tooth and tie the other end to a brick bat and throw it over the fence. I never did this, of course, but I was terrified, and so I pulled my own teeth fairly quickly. Maybe that was the point. I don't know. This poem is called How I Lost My Voice, and it's for Peter Grambois. It's written in 5 sections. 1. A naughty child has left night's door ajar. In a sepia waking, my mother slams that door, its porcelain knob tethered to my loose tooth. By this method, my tongue is taught to be still. 2. At the kitchen sink, my grandmother's arthritic claws scurry over the board, where a headless capon crows a final defiant boast that converges with blood tongues to circle backwards down the drain's dark throat. Thus I am taught to devour silence. 3. After Sunday school, I build a tinker toy Tower of Babel. In my myth, I scale the gleaming walls of curiosity's cabinet, where tiny skulls lurk among labels and the aspirin tastes like oranges. Discovered by mother, I confess I swallowed one, and one only, to soothe a toothache. Her unbelieving fingers force me to vomit up the truth. I must wait, I am told, for my father's return. Thus I am taught the efficacy of lies. 4. The rooted force the rootless to release their hold. Each new tooth rises like a headstone in a graveyard of dead speech. As the years progress, they grow crowded, topple. Words wear away. The tongue lies in the mouth like a corpse in a coffin. Thus I learn the limits of metaphor. 5. In the final stanza, I sit alone in an empty room, lit by a pill-sized moon. I hold one end of a pale thread. It winds across the floor into darkness, where the end is tied to the bone knob of death's open door. I open my mute mouth wide, tie my end in a tiny noose around my last loose tooth. Well, we are, it would seem, coming to the end of this horrible pandemic. I'm hoping for the best, although I understand we need to get things under control in other parts of the world as well. So I'm going to inflict a pandemic poem upon you. There are many of them circulating out there right now for good reason. I mean, poets are drawn to things like this, of course, and it affected so many of us. This poem is written in a sequence of 6 haiku. It's called The Distance. 6 feet between us, we viewed the cherry blossoms, defiant beauty. We laughed behind masks as pink petals drifted down. A lone crow had flown. 6 feet between us, the teacup warm in my hands. I could smell the sea. The apparition of masked faces in a crowd. When will it be safe? Supine in the grass, my body is 6 feet long. Why were you the one? Safe with a vaccine, in spring, I visit your grave. 6 feet between us. And I think I'll end with a lighter poem, somewhat lighter. I seem incapable of writing completely light poems, but this is a sonnet for those of you that may be interested in form. And the title is a Dutch phrase, De piep aan Maartenhaven, which means to give the pipe to Martin, which is a euphemism for dying, apparently, in Dutch. And this poem has an epigraph from the Oxford English Dictionary. Languages usually don't borrow words from abroad for central life experiences, but die words are an exception. They often are hidden or changed euphemistically out of a superstitious dread. A Dutch euphemism translates as to give the pipe to Martin. De piep aan Maartenhaven. My parents sat me down when I was 6 and told me we'd lost Uncle Joe. Let's look for him, I cried. But he'd cashed in his chips, kicked the bucket, died. The things we say to take the long way round that monosyllable, whose closest ancient English kin was stiorfan, to starve, as if the verb to die were fillable with something less severe to dwell on. Who's Martin? Not even the Dutch can tell you. And why give him the pipe? Perhaps smoking, that ascendant carnal pleasure, once you're through going belly up, biting the dust, croaking, is a fitting symbol for one's final breath, a gasp we understand at last to be a kind of laugh. All right, well, those are the poems that I had prepared to read to you.
Thank you so much, Josh. Those poems were beautiful. haunting, and I have a lot of things to ask, and I'm sure the audience does too. I see our mutual friend Ruja Mohasesi sends her
Oh,
regards.
yeah. I've
Yeah,
met her. Yeah, wonderful, wonderful poet.
yes. I always learn something when I encounter your poems, and I learned something new today. And that seems to be something that I often struggle with, of how to provide information and how to imbue a poem with that kind of knowledge, with that new knowledge, not just linguistic flexing, not just unique metaphors or imagistic um, uh, uh, acrobatics, but just plain language and plain knowledge, like the knowledge of the fact that central core experiences, as you said, don't tend to translate. Right? Is that how that went? The central core experiences were the ones that didn't tend to translate well. Um, and so maybe I've seen a lot of etymology, interest in etymology of things, of words, um, in your poems. And this isn't something that I had kind of prepared, but it's just something that came across on hearing your poems, your new poems. But maybe if you could talk about how it starts with one of those facts, or how it leads into the poem. And for you, is one of those like interesting uh, pieces of knowledge start in like as like a note in a journal, and then it ends its way in the poem, or does the poem kind of meet it, I guess? Where in the process of writing do those tidbits of knowledge come in?
Mhm. Well, yeah, your observation pleases me, I guess, because I mean, I'm fascinated by etymology.
Mm.
And whether or not it's apparent in my poems, it's almost always there in some way or other. Because one of the things I do when I compose is I often I compose on my laptop primarily, sometimes simultaneously in a journal. But there's a free online etymological dictionary, and I just have it open. And if I'm interested in a word, and I'm often interested in older words, archaic words, I will put it in there and I will see how it developed, how it evolved.
Mm.
And this is fascinating to me because, words have a kind of evolutionary history. I think it was Emerson who said that language is fossil poetry. This quote of his, something to that effect. And this fascinates me for a couple reasons. One, people tend to misuse words, and it seems to me as poets, one of our duties is to use words correctly. One of the things that's, I don't know about you, Marcelo, but drives me up the wall these days is how everyone uses the word literally. I literally just sat down, when clearly they're not speaking figuratively, right? So it's become a kind of, just a little fad. And so I will look at what words mean, and often I realize that they don't mean what we think they mean, or that they have shades of meaning. Sometimes in poems, I even investigate that. I have another poem I wrote recently when I was on sabbatical in the spring, and my focus was to write poems under the sort of term of social justice, which I found very difficult as a straight white male who's almost 60. But I wrote a poem dealing with a word spelled Niggard. Its origin is thought to be Scandinavian, and it just means stingy. But it's very close to the N word, of course. And most people don't know it at all. It appears I first encountered it in Faulkner, of all people, but you encounter it here or there. And The interesting thing about that was that word, I think you can't really use it because people will mistake it, or it's too close phonically to to the horrible N word. And so it got me thinking about how words evolve in and out of fashion. Some words you can use, some you can't, some are changed, some are used by sort of oppressed groups and turned around. And I'm just fascinated by this. And so I wrote a poem about that. But I like the idea that language is alive and it's constantly evolving and changing. And this, what a word means today might not be what it means tomorrow, but that vestige of its meaning will still be there. Mm-hmm. And just for a specific example, two words, gay and queer. When I was a little boy, my grandmother might say, "Oh, you're a gay little boy." Nowadays, the word has an entirely different connotation and wouldn't be used probably at all. So I just think that's very interesting how a word changes and its usages can change. So language is living and alive. So that's a long-winded explanation of why I do that. Now, when you put it into poetry, as you say, you have to be kind of careful that you don't sound like an encyclopedia. I don't know that I have any particular technique on doing that, except I do think that maybe the etymological, if you're going to put that information in, it needs to be central to the poem somehow, some aspect that the poem's investigating. You just don't want to give an aside to the reader. By the way, this word came from here and here and here. That would be rather intrusive, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. The way languages change, and as much as we want to think of literally maintaining its literalness, the fact that it is now used for effect rather than it's used for maybe effect is the wrong word, but for emphasis. That's what I meant to say. Used for emphasis to a degree. It's really interesting also, like new words that get entered into the dictionary. And I'm always looking out for which new words like made it in and how they, and the validity of words versus like slang, and how certain words take on like the validity of quote unquote being included in the lexicon. All really, really interested in something I'm really interested about too. Maybe I guess segueing into from that in like this common theme of etymology is also how your poems, your books, and even the poems that we encountered today deal with the natural world. I forever was changed by the class on ecopoetics that I took with you at Sac State, and I think about one particular essay in there by a writer named Neil Everdeen. I probably think about that essay maybe once a month, and I wanted to ask you about in your poems and in how your poems are in conversation with our place in the world, in the natural world, our interactions, our impact, our violences on the ecosystems that we have imbalanced perhaps irreparably, but nonetheless that we interact with. You run a magazine on ecopoetics, Clade Song, go check that out. Everybody, there's what do they call it? Easter eggs?
Yeah, Jen does Easter eggs.
Yeah, the co-editor does Easter eggs, so you like click on something that isn't really there, and then it leads you to something. It's kind of fun. But I guess I would call you an expert on ecopoetics. How do you embrace ecopoetics, and how do you see that in your work? Maybe even not necessarily like define ecopoetics, but maybe tell the audience a little bit about your ideas of what role poetry plays in the environment.
Yeah, well, I find it difficult to understand why everybody is not writing in that mode. Um, and the reason I say that is because that the ecological catastrophes that are, coming down the pike toward us are going to dwarf any other concern that we have. And I might add that I think many of those other concerns are related to the changes in the climate. Immigration is a good one. When you look at people who are leaving their homes because of political strife, often that's due to a shortage of resources. And if that's not the case, people are just going to be displaced for various reasons. They won't be able to grow food, the ocean will rise, etc. All that. So these things are related. And I mean, heck, when I moved to Sacramento 20 years ago, we had maybe 2 weeks of triple digit weather in the summer. And now, last summer, we had a month worth. So I find that, all these other concerns, I really feel like, wow, is there anything else that I should be writing about? And I do write other poems, but this comes back to me because this term, eco or ecology comes from a Greek word meaning home. And one way to think about it, as many people have posited, is we are sort of stewards of the planet, and we haven't been good stewards. So the question you asked specifically, though, was, what can poetry do? And, I listened the other day yesterday, actually, to Forrest Gander reading from his new book, Twice Alive, which was marvelous. And, he's somebody I would risk saying who probably feels that there's a way that poetry can somehow have an impact by looking at these concerns. I would like to agree. I'm not so sure that poetry changes anything, to quote Auden, because the people who are messing things up aren't reading poetry. And we're all messing things up, even though we don't want to, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it's pretty gloomy. So one of the things I do, though, is when I think about the natural world, I find myself being fascinated by the amazing things in it. Just, wondrous things. And of course, I grew up as well in the Pacific Northwest, Northern California, by which I mean the true Northern California, with Redding as a southern boundary, right? I mean, a third of the state is above San Francisco, which people think of as northern. I don't consider myself in Northern California here in Sacramento at all. And believe me, when you get up there north of Redding, you'll know what I mean, because that's the so-called state of Jefferson up there. I mean, it's different politically. It's sparsely populated, and it's something else. But I grew up in those places, and I like the out of doors very much, and I'm fascinated by everything from the first poem I read, Lepus, the catalyst for that poem was I saw a jackrabbit sitting down by the American River in the morning, and I saw sun sort of shining through the membrane of its ear. And all the little facts that are associated with that, why are the jackrabbit's ears big? Has to do with the dissipation of heat, right? So animals in hot climates have big ears often. Animals in cold climates have small ears, right? And all these things. So the vascularization of that, and then just sort of snowballs into a poem. And sometimes there are poems that investigate these things. And then that particular poem ended up being sort of visionary. But yeah, so for me, it's just a part of the things that I'm interested in my daily life. And I would be happy if someone would read a poem like that and say, oh, wow, that's really neat. I'll notice that next time I see a jackrabbit, I might think about that. Right? And maybe there's an educational element there, right? If you bring something to a reader's awareness that they hadn't thought of, maybe they'll be interested in that. And things that people are interested in, there's maybe a better chance that they would learn about that and then treat it better. I mean, it's kind of a Pollyanna view, but I hope it's true.
Yeah, and I mean, this is. Oh, I'm getting kind of a feedback. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you sound fine to me.
Okay. I'm just going to try to not listen to myself because I hear myself 2 seconds in the past. But I've heard this. No, let me take off my AirPods because that might be the problem. There we go. Can you hear me okay now?
Yes.
Okay. The problem didn't go away. It's okay. Um, I've heard of this argument over and over, and what can poetry do? What can poetry do to change this, or what can poetry do to change that? And I think it has also something to do with kind of the utilitarian aspects that we want to impose on poetry.
Mhm.
That it has to have a value outside of itself. It has to produce something. If I'm going to read poetry, I am investing my time into it, so I would be expecting something in return, kind of a return on your investment. You, and that's a very capitalistic way of thinking about poetry as a product, and I think that goes along into how we think of poetry. And so I didn't want to ask that question, like, what can poetry do? It just came out because I'm always cautious of that question. Why can't poetry just observe and be in wonder and investigate? I'm always also cautious of that conversation of leading into. I feel like it's a trick question, like what can poetry do? Well, isn't it what being in wonder enough, right?
Mhm.
Isn't that enough? And um, you know, policy is what's going to change things, but that's not necessarily the role of poetry. Our arena is somewhere else, and so that doesn't necessarily invalidate it. Um, in fact, it probably gives it more splendor because it exists both of that world of trying to change and also beyond that world. Because poems are gonna live longer than us. Um,
Let me just say I agree with you completely. I feel that, the answer I gave is one that, you get the question, what good is poetry? That has been asked to me in those very words quite directly. What good is poetry, right? So I have that sort of canned answer, but I agree with you. And ironically, this idea that poetry has to have a utility, this is the same problem we have with the natural environment, right? Why should we save the Amazon rainforest? Well, they tell you because the medicinal properties of the plants, we don't even know. There could be a cure for cancer there. It's all what we're going to get out of it, not just, hey, it's cool, leave it alone. It's its own thing. And of course, poetry is its own thing. And the utility of poetry is individual and spiritual. And it's not a social act, I don't believe, really. I mean, it can be in small, like-minded groups. But, so yeah, I hear you loud and clear.
yeah.
If you're a poet, you have to be an apologist for poetry, it seems.
Yeah, I mean that kind of leads also to the same argument that I tend to tell my students, and I wanted to talk about your experiences as a teacher as well. Invested in the pedagogy of creative writing, but especially, I mean, I'm teaching high school this year, and the worst thing that I feel like I can ask my students is like, what does this poem mean? Because they're just put on the spot, and we're approaching again poetry as something that you must extract from, and so using ecological terms, that it is a resource that provides some kind of knowledge that we can extract, and somehow we have to break it open. Somehow it is keeping something from us on purpose, that if we could just find this key that we can unlock its secrets, that poets do this on purpose. And these are all the things that like my high school students, even like some of my freshman students that I teach, have in common. I don't know, what their experiences have been with poetry up until the point that they reach me, but I really always try to um, begin with debunking that idea of like the utility of poetry, and that we must we must extract something from it. And let it just be. Not necessarily we don't want to understand it, but let it just be. And so, with that in mind, maybe if you could talk a little bit about how your experiences as a teacher, teaching students from all across the board in creative writing, but also business students, science majors, math majors who have never read a poem in their life, or at least critically, or even read a contemporary poet. But how has being a teacher of poetry informed your own work? Maybe either currently or throughout the years of your career as a teacher. Certainly has had some lasting impact. You being my former professor, and I know you've touched many other students as well. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about that.
Well, when you profess, as I do for a living, presumably you should know something about what you're talking about. And I think one of the things that teaching has done for me is to help me articulate, just because it's necessary, why I do what I do as a practicing writer, and some of the general ideas I have behind putting together a poem. And those, of course, have changed over the years as well. Listening to you talk about your experience there, I begin to think, in my recent return to surrealist work, I'm thinking maybe what I should do in a beginning poetry class is to begin like with Dada and surrealism and poetry that's been branded often as utter nonsense, poetry that resists meaning, that's part of its aim. Oh, and maybe also some children's poetry. If I can find something that's not moralistic with a lot of linguistic play. Some Seuss comes to mind. None that's been banned. So, just to start there and then worry about meaning later, perhaps, because that's always the problem, I think, that we get the way poetry's taught in the United States. We start out loving it, and nobody asks you what children's poetry means. You just love the sound of it. And then it disappears in about third grade, and it doesn't come back until high school. But then it's suddenly John Donne, and you're studying for the SATs. Yeah, it makes no sense. So in addition to learning to articulate what I think, I can't really say that I've drawn a whole lot of inspiration from my students, just in terms of, wow, because frankly, none of it's that innovative. And why would it be, right? They're often beginning. But I will say this. You mentioned students from different majors other than English. They're often my best students. And the reason why is because they bring a different perspective. And they don't necessarily know what a poem is, quote, supposed to be. Whereas an English major with a semester or two under their belt, that's the worst, right? Because they think they know everything. Another thing that's interesting at Sac State is we have a diverse student body, as you know. And I have many non-native speakers of English in my classes. I have people that speak Spanish at home, Hmong, and so on. Sometimes I've noticed that those students have the most interesting poetry at the syntactic level, because it might not be grammatical, but wonderful things begin to happen in the switching between the languages. And I've seen poets like that, actually, that over the course of a couple of years, as they got better with English, their poetry became less interesting. And I would take them aside and say, you remember this thing you used to do that they hated in your essays? Don't get rid of that in your poetry. So those kinds of little reminders, I guess, as to one of the things that keeps poetry alive and vibrant. And I like that idea of hybridizing with other languages as well, and getting a kind of, hybrid vigor between languages, the same way you would, if you're breeding guinea pigs or something. You want that kind of strength. And you don't get that by letting it do the same thing over and over and over.
Yeah, it's the newness, freshness that
without saying it, does get dampened down in English departments by over and over kind of repeating what you see. Because a lot of students mistake like imitation for they think if I copy this, and one of my favorite lines is I think one you said in your classes is Eliot's like good poets borrow, better poets steal, but also with nuance of your own instinctive drives of language. Um, and I think you pointed out what I think I was trying to articulate myself is, being a teacher of poetry allows you to articulate your own aesthetic, because you have to be able to speak it. You have to be able to talk the talk. And so I think one of the most terrifying experiences of my poetic life has been when I was asked when my first book kind of finally got picked up is, okay, so what is it about? Can you give us
Yeah.
a synopsis? Like, can you give us so that we can send to as like a little as a short synopsis that we can send to reviewers and whatnot. And that floored me like no other, because I had never realized how to speak about my own work. I could speak about other people and how their work was working, what the nuances were and everything. But then suddenly when I had to say that about my own work, this aesthetic statement about my own work and what it was doing, and I could say about this. I couldn't even talk about what subject matter I was mostly concerned with. So
Yeah.
yeah, definitely teaching has allowed me to have that like elevator line of explaining, oh, what is my own uh, work doing, and it's very difficult, I think, for a lot of poets to do that. Students who, because a lot of the things that we do come either instinctively or we don't realize exactly where we've picked up this language to be able to articulate that.
I think maybe ultimately that's the goal of a functional creative writing program too, is to teach students to develop that aesthetic. And hopefully, my students will down the road think back to the things I said and say, you know what? He was right about this and this, but he was dead wrong about this, this, and this. Right? Because I don't want to clone myself. And once you start thinking for yourself, once you're informed enough, then that's what you want. I do want to say another thing though that you remind me about, just the pleasure of teaching, and this is maybe not so much in terms of my own work, but just the sharing with people, because occasionally, as I saw with you and as I've seen with students over the years, you'll get somebody who really catches fire with poetry and something will change in their life. And you see that, and you see the excitement, and you feel that kinship because you remember when that happened for you. And you know that they'll go on and they'll probably continue to write for the rest of their life, whether they worry about publishing or not, whether they worry about, are they making a difference or any of that. They will make things, and that will be a pleasurable activity for them that does no harm. And that's significant.
Mm-hmm.
That's significant.
Yeah, to make is enough. Um, and
Which,
and
of
just
course, is what the etymology of the word poet means, right? Someone who makes things, a maker.
I like that. Yeah. Um, yeah, and I mean it is good to see those things happening. I think one of my favorite things to do at the end of the semester is for students to, now that we can be frank, now that their grades are basically almost entered, I like to ask them, so which poems did you absolutely hate, that you absolutely don't agree with, that I should have never included them, that you just do not like, and why? And so it's getting them to think about their own aesthetics, and to articulate, well, why doesn't this work for me? Why don't I think this is living up to the expectations that we might have discussed in class, and so on. So that's one of my favorite things to do, like final end of the semester things. And then they reveal to me things that hurt, because I love these poems dearly, And but it's good to have, for all writers and all poets, and I think all artists, to know what art they like and then what art they don't, and be able to articulate that. Um,
And some poems, you can return to over the years. I can think of poems that I did not like when I first read them, that I really liked years later. And I can think, of the opposite too. Poems that I thought were great, that over the years I realized aren't that great. And so I think that's a good, healthy sign as well.
Yeah, a really, like, a circular sign that you are continually being in awe and wonder, and also continuing to investigate. And maybe that can lead us to maybe this next question that I was talking about, that I was thinking about, and it had to do with maybe thinking about poems that you return to, and you either still like or you don't, or that you return to that you didn't like before and you do now. You also, we also tend to do that with our own writing, and the obsessions that we have, that we tend to come back to again and again. And I was gonna ask, like, what are some of the obsessions that you have come back to? And I know we're short for time, so I don't want to take up too much of your time. I don't think I've asked about family in particular, or I have. I might have confused it with our conversation earlier, but maybe.
You haven't asked yet.
Okay.
But I
So,
can speak to it.
right. So I was gonna talk about your book Smallcillion, and how you put your books together over the years, but also more specifically, actually no, family. That's what I was gonna talk about. How your family has been a recurring motif in your work, and maybe how has your writing on family changed over the years? I know, having a son now, I never would have imagined writing about my family, specifically because my first book doesn't deal with a particular family member or anything like that. It was a lot more nameless. But as soon as I had my son, like, all of the new work that I've been working on has been on my son. And so has your poems kind of evolved as your family has grown? Um, yeah.
I think, yeah, but not just in the fact that my children appear from time to time as characters, in the poems, but more in the fact that as my children have aged and as I have aged, my relationship to them and to the world in general is changing. My awareness of my own mortality is heightened and heightening daily. And so I think those kinds of themes occur more. Probably all told, my kids haven't appeared in more than a dozen poems, over the years. It certainly affected my writing habits, as I can imagine, being a father has done for you. When I used to be a nighttime writer, and then I had to switch to being a morning writer, and so on. But no, more the themes. A wonderful thing about having small children is if you just listen to what they say, they'll give you lines for poems, right?
Yeah.
Because they have that freshness of perception and that amazement with every aspect of the world. And then, later on, you see them go through things, and it reminds you of things. Maybe there's a sort of emotional tenor there that gets you thinking about something, and that might lead to a poem. I guess what I'll call is sort of vicarious living through your children, which I'm certainly guilty of, especially in their athletics.
Yeah, because there's that Louis Click line. We live the world once in childhood, the rest is in memory. And so if we can't necessarily remember our own childhood, we can probably look at it through our child's experiences. So thank you for that. And I know you are a very busy person, so maybe I would like to perhaps end with this question of what's occupying your creative concerns or imagination right now. What are you reading? Maybe you have a summer reading stack lined up that you're looking forward to. So what are some of the books that you are reading right now?
Well, yeah, I have a large stack. I can barely keep up with just the publications of my friends. So I'll mention the things that I've been reading recently. As I mentioned, Forrest Gander has a new book out called Twice Alive. My mentor and friend Donald Ravel has a wonderful new book from Alice James called White Campion. I just read Jennifer Sweeney's new book that was amazing, and also sort of influenced by her children, I think, in interesting ways. My friend Jim Benton, a former student of mine, has a wonderful new book out called The Book of Sympathetic Magic. Peter Grambois, my friend and former colleague who now lives in Ohio, he has 2 new books of poetry simultaneously. One called Last Night I Aged 100 Years, and the other one, Everything Has Become Birds, which I just got, which is a fascinating sort of investigation of, I guess, sort of like mental illness through the centuries. Wonderful. And so those are just, and then I have a few students who are publishing chapbooks that are coming out. So that's going to be, I'm going to have to teach those soon. That'll be a pleasure. So yeah, I can barely keep up with what my friends are. And then I just discovered, because I'm reading surrealism now again, and that's sort of fusing with my interest in ecopoetics. Maybe it's already been coined, but I'm going to say that I'm going to be writing some eco-surrealism soon, and we'll see what happens with that. Yeah. So there's a long list of books waiting to be read a third and fourth time on my shelf. That's for sure.
Yeah, as is always the case, I have more books than on my shelf that I have actually read, but they're there waiting for me. Um, so, Josh, I wanted to. I know you have some events happening right up after this, so I don't want to take up too much of your time. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. I loved hearing your insights, and it's always such a pleasure to talk with you. So I think we can end it there. And
thank you, Marcelo. It's so good to see you and to spend time with you. We should do this more often. We're not that far away.
No. I'm fully vaccinated, so.
As am I. Good, wonderful. Well, maybe we can do that before the summer's over then. And thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right, wonderful. Thank you. And I'll have Abby cut off the transmission. I don't know if that's the word.